Do Democrats have real reasons to be worried about how people perceive the economy to be doing?
So I think the polling is pretty solid. There's been several polls recently that show this. So it's not like, fluke polls or something like that. But it shows that despite the strong labor market, unemployment is pretty low right now. And despite GDP being strong, so economic output, the economy is still growing. I think the big factor of what is causing this is one word, and that's inflation. While inflation is not as strong as it was last year, it's running at 3.7% right now, which is still above like the 2% norm that the Federal Reserve is trying to push for.
Right.
It still is nowhere near the 9.1% that was being felt in June of last year. But when you're a consumer and you're going out to the store and buying things, you're not necessarily looking at it, oh, this is only 3.7% higher, these eggs than they were last year.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by economics reporter Zach Halaschak. Zach, we've seen this United Auto Workers strike has been going on, and presidential candidates and the president have gotten involved. What's the status right now of the dispute between the auto workers and the big three?
We're just over 2 weeks now, and it strikes against the three big automakers, Ford, Stellantis, which is formerly Chrysler, and GM. And right now, it started when they announced a strike 2 weeks ago that they only were striking 3 plants, one from each of the big three automakers. But as negotiations kept going over the preceding week, last week it was announced that they were going to ratchet up strikes at GM and Stellantis. Shawn Fain, who's the president of UAW, the union involved, said that negotiations were going pretty well with Ford. They were making some progress, but with Stellantis and GM, there were some hiccups. And so he actually expanded the strikes out to, I think it's like 36 different plants across several U.S. states, mainly Michigan, but a few other states also have plants that are now facing work stoppages. So it's gotten more intense. And it's also built up more political pressure. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump both went to Michigan this week and met with current and former UAW members. Biden notably joined the strike. He joined the picket line, which I don't think a sitting president has ever done, which builds his bona fides for blue collar and union workers, but has got some criticism because you would think as president, you're supposed to kind of remain neutral on such matters. And then Trump visited a facility and he spoke, I don't think it was a union facility, but gave a speech to some former and current UAW workers, which coincided with the GOP presidential debate, which he set out and instead kind of did counter-programming by going to that group of workers and discussing just the strike in general.
Now, what do the other Republican presidential candidates have to say about the strike? I mean, some of them are much more critical of labor unions than from President Trump is.
Yeah, absolutely. Trump has kind of cast himself in this like populist mold, so kind of like a blue collar champion of the worker, that sort of thing. He's been careful not to kind of get into the intricacies of the pay demands and the union structures, but more there for the worker. On the debate stage, you had some candidates like Tim Scott and Nikki Haley who are much more forceful against unionization and have spent their careers kind of going after the unions. I know that Tim Scott has said when he was asked last week about the strike, he quoted Ronald Reagan, who famously laid off the federal air traffic controllers during, I think it was 1981, when they refused to come into work. And he kind of invoked that recently. And the first question of the night actually was about the ongoing UAW strike. And it was to Scott. And they just asked, would you support firing these striking workers? And obviously he said as president, he can't fire private sector employees, but did land on the side of he's not in favor of more power to the unions and not in favor of handing more power to the union bosses. A sentiment that was echoed among pretty much all the other candidates on the stage, and a pretty stark contrast to Trump, who's literally meeting with the auto workers when that debate was taking place.
So there are a lot of polling right now that shows Republicans have a pretty big advantage on the economy, and that's got Democrats concerned about 2024. What is the reason that they enjoy this advantage? And, is it maybe a mirage like we saw right before the midterm elections? Or do Democrats have real reasons to be worried about how people perceive the economy to be doing?
So I think the polling is pretty solid. There's been several polls recently that show this. So it's not like, fluke polls or something like that. But it shows that despite the strong labor market, unemployment is pretty low right now. And despite GDP being strong, so economic output, the economy is still growing. I think the big factor of what is causing this is one word, and that's inflation. While inflation is not as strong as it was last year, it's running at 3.7% right now, which is still above like the 2% norm that the Federal Reserve is trying to push for.
Right.
It still is nowhere near the 9.1% that was being felt in June of last year. But when you're a consumer and you're going out to the store and buying things, you're not necessarily looking at it, oh, this is only 3.7% higher, these eggs than they were last year.
Right.
You're thinking, well, 3 years ago, before all this, everything's like 20-30% more expensive because it compounds each year. And so that's what consumers are noticing. I think it kind of ticks them off sometimes when they hear the messaging from the White House too, saying, oh, the economic situation is great, but when you're a blue collar worker, a middle class worker who's having trouble affording, putting food on the table, it's pretty hard to say that the economy's all, fine and dandy.
Right. That's the real risk of trying to talk up the economy before an election. What's been the impact of oil prices recently on inflation?
So while inflation largely over the summer it's ticked up the past couple months, but it's been in the threes, hasn't been shooting up, hasn't been going down very quickly. There is some price pressure being put on because of higher oil prices, and gas prices actually were at a seasonal high, the highest level they were in seasonal terms in 10 years recently, because usually in the summer, that's when gas prices are the highest. They're up in the summer, people are fueling their cars, there's high demand, and then as the summer fades away into the fall, there's less demand, so people aren't, prices naturally go down. That's not really been the case. Prices have actually ticked up recently. There's a couple reasons behind that. One is just underlying pent-up demand from the post-COVID environment, but also OPEC countries and controlling how much oil is on the market, that sort of thing. But how that affects overall inflation is, for example, say you're a company that ships goods from Idaho to Florida, and it costs 8% more to put fuel in your car. You're going to have to pass that cost on to consumers somehow. So that's where it gets tricky with inflation, because it isn't just you're paying more at the pump. Everything pretty much runs on energy. And then also you have to keep in mind too, as we approach winter, people are going to start having to burn fuel oil. That's going to have to be used more. So heating your home is going to be more expensive. So it just kind of hurts consumers across the board and can have some pretty concerning longer term effects if it stays high for too long and kind of it trickles through the overall economy and forms that kind of higher sticky inflation, which is something the Fed is really, really hoping to avoid.
So the Democrats are hoping they won't be running on empty next year.
That's right.
Thank you, Zach.
Yep.
You can read Zach and the rest of our policy team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.